My name is Barbara Sosic, and I'm a curator of the Rural Economy and Transport Collection at the Slovene Ethnographic Museum in Ljubljana. I would like to share with you some of my thoughts about the museum in researching, collecting, and presenting materials connected to draft animals, which started to disappear from Slovenian fields, forests, and roads about 5 or 6 decades ago. After the 1980s, an ox or horse-drawn cart became a sign of social exclusion or poor adaptation, often connected with poverty. As in many parts in Europe, after World War II, people were abandoning the peasant way of life. The share of the farming population dropped from the pre-war 70% to mere 20% in 1970s and to 8% in 1991, when Slovenia gained independence. Since then, the share has continued to fall and is today estimated at 4%. The museum's mission of collecting, interpreting, and sharing knowledge of our ancestors' way of life is stored in a number of objects in our agricultural and other collections, together with the stories they tell. Field photos, field trip notes, and footage, including of draft animals. This can be seen at our permanent exhibition entitled Between Nature and Culture, and much more in our storage depots, archives, in articles and books. Many of these materials can be seen on the museum's website. But first, let me present a short overview of the use of draft animals in our environment. On the medium-heavy soil covering a great part of Slovenia, a small country in Central Europe, where we have steep Alps, hilly Dolenjska region, Pannonian plains, and a Mediterranean area, the most common draft animals were oxen. In level areas, also cows. The most numerous group in Slovenia, in the medium-sized farms, cultivated their fields and worked in their woods with one pair of working oxen. It was not until the end of the 19th century that horses became important as draft animals. A small horse takes away a large fortune was a proverb saying that not every farmer could afford a horse. In the Mediterranean area, donkeys were also used, mainly for transportation. Until the establishment of machines and transport vehicles in the second half of the 20th century, animals were used as draft or pack animals and for riding. In Slovene areas, livestock was harnessed into yokes or horse collars. Yokes were used for cattle. Our ancestors were using them in the time of settlement of what is now Slovenian territory in the 6th century AD or even earlier. They were used for centuries whenever carting or plowing was done using oxen or cows. Yokes were designed either for pulling with head or with neck. There were also Mediterranean yokes with canvas for harnessing one or two animals together, and we also have Slovene yokes known as telenge. Yokes were most often made at home and were frequently decorated. Horse collars were occasionally used for cattle or donkeys and were placed on the animal's neck, forehead or back. They were made by saddlers from wood, covered in leather and had metal decorations. There were a number of local variants of the collar, but they differ generally between working and festive collars, and collars for pulling light or heavy weights. After World War II, horse collars started losing their original function and began being used as decoration and were put on animals only on festive occasions. As a curiosity, The Giberna family, about 20 years ago, after 3 decades break, started raising a pair of oxen, but they used them only for festive occasions and public events. Such use of draft animals is referred to as theater of history. Everywhere they go, they attract a lot of attention from people of all generations and can make, especially the elderly, who still remember working with and driving oxen, quite emotional. To perform at a few events a year, they have to put a lot of work into caring for the animals and into demanding preparations. Our museum has an interesting livestock collection from the 19th and 20th centuries, represented mainly by harnesses. In the 1950s and 60s, right at the time when extensive museum field research was being carried out in the Slovenian countryside, the use of draft animals was still an everyday phenomenon, and the museum is especially proud of the collection of ox yokes built during that time. Moreover, we have extensive documentation from that time, photos, drawings, and field trip notes. For 2 decades now, my dear colleague, Ines Mardel, has been researching and publishing articles on the relationship between man and ox and the cultural aspects of working oxen in peasant civilization. Her approach is comparative, but based on Slovenian material. She focuses on testimonies about oxen within the peasant family and the village community, about working companionship in some basic farm tasks, plowing, harrowing, towing, and driving, about castration, shoeing, feed and grazing, about naming oxen, about learning, harnessing and commands, about diseases and treatment, about choosing new and selling used oxen, and so on. Collecting objects and other documents on draft animals is still going on. We see it as a bank of information for future generations, who we believe will find it interesting, inspiring, and useful, in spite of the fact that the knowledge was not passed on directly from generation to generation inside of families or communities as it used to be. Life has changed and we can never go back. Throughout history, people always find some new way forward, but by knowing our past, we can be wiser and more effective in the future. Today, both individuals and families live a more or less self-contained life, relying on themselves, their employment possibilities, various state and social institutions, but with this, they became very vulnerable. The uncertainty and fear and the realization of our own limitations brought on by the pandemic have only made it all the more urgent that we rethink our styles of life, our relationships, the organization of our societies, and so on. People in general are not very skilled at physical or farm work and have little knowledge of the environment and nature. They spend most of their working and even free time indoors. But we all know that physical work regenerates, revigorates the mind, and it has always been the basis of human development. The German political leader Konrad Adenauer's saying, "To look back into the past only makes sense if it serves the future," is also true for museums. The motto of our museum is that we are a museum about people, for people, a link between the past and the present, between traditional and modern culture, between the natural environment and civilization. Now, more and more people feel that we live in a time of insecurity, and those who know some history are aware that such crises might predict drastic changes for the future. Our generation depends on many networks and technologies driven by systems that depend greatly on different energy sources, sometimes also with limited resources. What we observe in museums is that even through new technologies, the knowledge and skills of our ancestors are becoming of increasing interest, from school children to elderly people and all ages in between, but especially to the later, as they try to find relief from their stressful life in gardening or small-scale farming. At our permanent exhibition Between Nature and Culture, we present objects related to transport, growing and processing crops connected to draft animals in ways that have not been practiced for decades. Observing the visitors, we have noticed that in particular older people born in the countryside strongly relate to these collections because they are associated with memories of their youth and work on the land. However, what can such objects tell today's urbanized people who have never walked the land and have no experience with draft animals? We try to start from a personal experience and build on what a person knows and is familiar with. We have to be innovative to interpret to the visitors the former values defining the rural environment and the significance of draft animals in it. It is also necessary to explain that draft animals were regarded as means of subsistence. The attitude towards these animals was sometimes different than we might initially think, as was the general attitude towards animals. Over the last century, these values have greatly changed. Due to many cases of mistreatment, manuals and even decrees were passed as early as the mid-19th century to protect draft animals from neglect and even cruelty. We never idealize the past. We try to interpret it as realistically as possible. It was hard, and people had to work hard. They had to be very skillful and persistent, to never give up. They had very complex knowledge of the care and use of draft animals, about the environment, which was built on from generation to generation. We try to illustrate work with draft animals by including audiovisual material that illustrates the use and functions of the exhibited objects. But what fascinates visitors most is man's strong ties to natural environment in the past, which actually enabled people to survive. Knowing our heritage, we can be surer and more confident of a sustainable future, of the challenges and opportunities of safeguarding traditions in which draft animals might again play an important role. The knowledge incorporated in museums' collections could be a good example of how to make the most of our history and the achievements of our ancestors for generations to come. Thank you very much for your attention.